More than 100 years after his death, Enrico Caruso is still considered by many to be the gold standard of the modern tenor. All his subsequent tenor colleagues refer to him: Gigli, Björling, Del Monaco, Pavarotti, Domingo and Kaufmann. Caruso's artistic life was a genuine rags-to-riches career. To the outside world, he was always a beaming man. Is this image true? Who was Enrico Caruso and what places and people influenced him? A biographical approach to the artist of the century from Italy. This photo shows the Caruso family home. Enrico, whose baptismal name was Enrico, was born on February 25, 1873. According to the Caruso legend, his mother, Anna, gave birth to 20 children, but in fact there were 7 and Enrico was the third. His father was an employed craftsman and the family did not suffer any material hardship despite their rather poor circumstances. 2 people must be emphasized for the musical development. Firstly, the choir master at the Chiesa di Sant'Anna alle Paludi church. He recognized Enrico's talent, accepted him into the choir, and encouraged him. Secondly, the sister of the family doctor, who helped Enrico to get rid of the Neapolitan dialect when singing the liturgical texts. The boy's voice must have sounded very beautiful, because thanks to the encouragement, Enrico became a soloist in the church. There were also other instructors who helped temporarily, and Enrico showed great skill and talent in absorbing their suggestions. Like his father, Enrico also learned the trade of mechanic. And when he was 15 years old, his mother died at home while he was singing in the church service. She had always encouraged him to sing in church, and Caruso later emphasized that her memory was an important motivation to take up the singing profession. At the age of 17, he tried to make a living as a singer. These young singers were called scunizzi, which means street children. A professional singer heard him singing Neapolitan songs in a cafe and introduced him to the singing teacher Guglielmo Vergine. Over the next few years, he gave the penniless Enrico professional lessons on the condition that 25% of his future earnings would go to him over the next few years. Enrico was drafted into the army at the age of 21. He endeavored to practice his voice every evening. And an art-loving nobleman living nearby found out about the talented recruit and made it possible for Caruso to be discharged from military service after a month. In his place, his younger brother Giovanni did his military service, which would lead him into the Abyssinian War 4 years later. Enrico was grateful to his brother for this sacrifice for the rest of his life. When Caruso was at the beginning of his career, Italian opera was in the midst of 2 incredibly fruitful decades. The history of these 2 decades was significantly influenced by the publishing houses Ricordi and Sonzogno. Giuseppe Verdi wrote his late works and Puccini was at the beginning of his brilliant career. Both of these greats have been under contract with Ricordi, Verdi already for 50 years. But in the 80s, a strong competitor began to emerge. The publisher Sonzogno had begun to attract promising future hopefuls with a competition for young composers. This strategy had not worked with Puccini, but it did with Mascagni's sensational opera Cavalleria Rusticana, and Sonzogno was able to achieve a gigantic success with this opera in 1889. Just a few years later, Sonzogno was able to follow suit when Ruggero Leoncavallo landed a surprising mega hit with Pagliacci and was now on par with Ricordi. In order to better exploit his growing number of works, Sonzogno began to run opera houses on his own account. In Naples, he took over the Teatro Mercadante, where Nicola da Spuro managed the business on his behalf. Caruso's teacher Vergine was able to arrange an audition with Daspuro. Caruso had recently passed his baptism of fire in the provinces in a small opera performance of Cavalleria Rusticana, and he now hoped to place his pupil at the influential Sonzogno Teatro. When the day of the audition came, Caruso was extremely nervous. He could not keep to the tempi, and his voice repeatedly cracked on the high notes. Daspuro cancelled his debut, and Caruso left the theatre in tears. This incident was the prelude to a crazy year. First, Caruso was able to impress in a performance in the provinces and got an engagement in Caserta, where he had to rehearse 3 operas within a few weeks, 2 of which were new. This earned him a further engagement in Naples, where he obviously excelled in Faust, and an engagement for the upcoming season in the Egyptian Cairo. There, half a dozen stage works awaited him that he did not yet know, and legend has it that in Manon he asked his stage partner in the 4th act to stand so that she covered the piano score from which Caruso was sight singing. Further engagements followed in Sicily, and so Caruso had to learn a dozen roles within 16 months, which he was only able to do thanks to his fantastic memory. The first important encounter in the following months was with the publisher Edoardo Sonzogno, who, on Daspuro's advice, called Caruso to Milan. He called him to the Teatro Lirico, which Sonzogno had newly leased as a rival to La Scala. Before Caruso came to Milan, he accepted an engagement for Verdi's Traviata in Livorno, and fell in love with the married prima donna and stage partner Ada Giachetti. Caruso's performance as Alfredo was very well received by the audience, and the theatre director wanted to engage Caruso for the Bohème at the Livorno Theatre, which was scheduled at short notice. Puccini, who was very keen to ensure that the singers in his operas were up to the role, was cautious and demanded that the unknown Caruso come to nearby Torre del Lago to audition. This happened, and Caruso sang Che gelida manina in Puccini's home, accompanied by the composer. The rest is legend, and at the end of the performance, the visibly moved composer said, "Who sent you, God?" The performance on August 14, 1897, in the presence of Puccini was a triumph. After this success, Ada Giachetti began to reciprocate Caruso's feelings. Until then, Ada, an upper-class northern Italian, had been skeptical of Enrico, a provincial southern Italian. But the whole thing had to be kept secret. Her husband should not find out about this relationship, because adultery in Italy could have dire consequences. Now Caruso's path finally led him to Milan. Ada stayed at home with her husband, and Caruso had to live in a cheap boarding house in Milan, as Sonzogno had been able to hire the tenor for a pittance. Caruso was able to convince the skeptical Sonzogno, and in just 3 months he was entrusted with the first premiere of his career, Cilea's Arlesiana. The audience was blown away, and the composer remembered it years later. The memory of that event is so vivid in my soul, so unique, that I still hear his captivating voice as if it were yesterday. So it was not a surprise that for the even more important premiere of Giordano's Fedora the following year, Sonzogno and the composer chose Caruso for the tenor role, and the performance under the composer's baton was a triumph. With this success, Caruso became Italy's leading tenor, and shortly afterwards received an offer from the St. Petersburg Opera as part of a star lineup. The tour of Russia was to last 2 months, and the fee was a whopping 6,000 lire per month instead of the meager 500 lire in Milan. That means 12 times the market value. And the icing on the cake, Ada Giacchetti was there as a singer. Caruso now broke away from Sonzogno and performed at La Scala for the first time in 1900 under the direction of Toscanini. This time it didn't work out right from the start. Caruso had to sing in the first performance despite health problems, and criticism rained down on him. Toscanini was also disappointed. But then, Caruso took La Scala by storm with Elisir d'Amore, and even Toscanini acknowledged, "By God, if this Napolitan continues to sing like this, the whole world will be talking about him." Caruso could now choose his engagement, and this year they took him to South America, among other places. The Napolitan was proud to accept an invitation from his hometown. However, the tenor no longer had to enter through the back door in the Mercadante, but took the main entrance into the proud San Carlo. What happened that evening in the San Carlo is a matter of debate. What is certain is that it was not Caruso's best evening. The audience's reaction was lukewarm, and the criticism in the most important newspaper the following day was nuanced with light and shade. Caruso was shocked and ashamed. He even thought he heard boos, and the following sentence was reported from him. "Naples will never hear me again. I will only return to Naples to see my dear mother again and to eat vermicelli with mussels." Whether this statement is true or it was later put into his mouth by Daspuro is debatable, but the fact is that Caruso was never to perform in Naples opera houses again. Caruso now sang all the major opera houses in Europe and was celebrated everywhere. What was the reason for Caruso's triumphs? Why was he such a sensation? To explore this question, let's listen to a 1902 recording of his tenor colleague Fernando de Lucia. Um dieser Frage nachzugehen, hören wir zuerst eine Aufnahme seines Tenorkollegen und 15 Jahre älteren Fernando de Lucia von 1902 an. De Lucia was a representative of the old style, the classical bel canto. We hear a lot of vibrato, and the voice is conducted more lightly, in favor of agility, but at the expense of impact. Let us now listen to the same bars sung by Enrico Caruso.
La donna nobile, qual più albergo, uva da tempo di pensiero, sempre una mobile, lega troviso, il pianeta in riso.
The two interpretations are worlds apart. What has happened? At the end of the 80s, Mascagni had established musical verismo. This style combined realistic theatre with raw, emotional music. The artful song performance of bel canto was abandoned in favor of dramatic vocal lines. Caruso's recording from La Donna Mobile was from the famous Milan recordings of 1902. Caruso recorded 10 titles in a few hours in one afternoon, and they were the first ever bestsellers in recording history. Due to the attractive mid-range, his voice was particularly suitable for phonography. In 1904, his life took a decisive turn. The New York Metropolitan Opera engaged the celebrated tenor, and it was to become his artistic home during the winter months for the next 16 years. At the beginning, the director of the Met had doubts as to whether the conservative audience would appreciate Caruso's stile nuovo. But his fears were unfounded. The so-called Caruso nights were always sold out and became the Met's trademark. And Caruso's evening fee grew astronomically. During these years, New York experienced a gigantic wave of immigration from Italy. And the music-mad Italians were proud of their Caruso, an Italian who had made it big in the New World. Caruso remembered his youthful years only too fondly and began to cultivate the Napoletano Canzone of the 19th century for the homesick Italians, interpreted with a sophisticated art of performance. His unforgettable Core Ingrato by the emigrant Salvatore Cardillo became an emblematic piece. In the meantime, Ada had given birth to two sons, Rodolfo and Enrico, who were named after two characters in Puccini's Bohème. He bought Villa Bellosguardo near Florence, and the family spent the summer months at this beautiful residence. Unfortunately for Ada, she realized that Caruso was not always serious about marital fidelity. Presumably, but not certainly, Ada's sister Rina was not safe from Caruso's appetite either. At this critical moment, Caruso also became the unfortunate victim of a scandal. A woman sued Caruso for an alleged sexual assault at the New York Zoo. Due to his wealth, Caruso was the victim of blackmail several times in his career, and the story from the zoo was widely reported in the press. Caruso vehemently denied the accusations, and his protestation of innocence seemed credible, as Caruso was always described as a man of integrity by everyone he knew. However, for Ada, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and she ran away to South America with her driver and tried to claim a lot of money from the father of her children through the courts over the next few years. This mudslinging was picked up with relish in the press. In 1908, the Met faced an epochal change. The new director, the Italian Gatti Casazza, brought in his specialist Arturo Toscanini as chief conductor for the Italian repertoire. Gustav Mahler, the newly appointed chief conductor for the German repertoire, left a year later, exasperated, and the triumphal march of Italian opera in the Met began. Caruso now sang a gigantic program at the Met. It was not uncommon for him to sing 3 times a week, and his evenings were always sold out. His stage partner Geraldine Farrar reported how she stood on stage with Caruso for the first time and missed her cue because she was moved to tears by the beauty of Caruso's singing. Canio from Pagliacci became the role of his life. He sang it in an incredible 116 times at the Met alone. With the 4 different solo appearances that Canio has, he was able to expand the range of his stage art formidably, and with the experience of his love life, he was able to put himself into Canio's shoes easily and believably. His recording of the famous Sobs from Vesti la Giubba became the first record in recording history to sell over 1 million copies. In 1909, Giacomo Puccini also became the victim of his love life, and the scandal of the Doria Manfredi affair drove him temporarily to New York, where he was received with open arms by the 3 Italians. Puccini now wrote the opera La Fanciulla del West for the Met and wrote the main tenor role of Dick Johnson for Caruso, which was a great career highlight for the Italian tenor. Caruso was known to be an excellent characterist, and no one was safe from Caruso's keen eye and hand, not even the famous Maestro Puccini. What kind of person was Caruso? Posterity knows the man Caruso quite well from many accounts. As a summary, allow me to reproduce a description by a singer from the Hamburg ensemble, who 60 years later described his impression of Caruso as follows in the German newspaper Welt. Even the way he stepped out of the cab, elegantly and fashionably dressed with a wide-brimmed hat and white spats, it looked like a stage performance. Caruso was a constant victim of a fear of failing. Caruso was the only one allowed to smoke in the wings. He was severely stricken by stage fright and almost chain-smoked. But then he also sang Pagliacci with such fervor that he cried real tears and produced sobs of genuine sorrow. Caruso's private conductor stood in the side stage with the score, ready to assist his maestro at any moment. At the end of his guest performance, he invited the singers to breakfast in a restaurant and showed them how to eat spaghetti properly. Caruso's success was not only due to his voice, he was also the tenore nuovo of acting. In the 19th century, a singer's acting talent was unimportant. Only a few rehearsed, hollow movements were necessary, the rest was ramp singing. Caruso changed the role and became a singer-actor. From today's perspective, this is extremely astonishing as Caruso is not known to have ever held a book in his hand. Nevertheless, he was able to shape his role in such a way that even the previously skeptical and stern Richard Strauss admitted admiringly after performance, "He sings the psyche of the melody." Let us come back to Caruso's voice. Caruso was a lyric tenor by nature, who at the beginning of his international career was able to show his best sides in operas such as L'Elisir d'Amore and La Bohème. His voice also had great richness of color, lush volume, and a beautiful middle range. What he always had difficulties with were the top notes. He was not always able to sing a clean high C. Caruso now began to sing more and more dramatic roles, and his voice changed as a result. In the last few years, his voice even sank into dark baritonal registers. Let's listen to one of Caruso's last recordings. Caruso never took it easy on himself. He was the first tenor to sing in an open-air stadium for 25,000 people. Certain critics accused him of constantly singing under a lot of pressure, which may have contributed to damage to his health. In 1912, severe headaches began to make themselves felt. These migraine-like attacks were to accompany him for the rest of his life. Caruso suffered greatly, but he certainly did not let them show. He often swallowed aspirin in order to be able to sing the many performances until the end. The reason for the raging headaches were unclear. Was it due to his heavy cigarette consumption or the constant stress? In 1918, Caruso married Dorothy Benjamin, an American 20 years his junior. She was to be the last love of his life, as Caruso's agony began 2 years later. At first he suffered from severe toothache and then began to suffer from insomnia. Unfortunately, he was the victim of a stage accident at the end of 1920, when he was hit hard on the lower back by a falling prop during a rehearsal. During the performance a week later, he spat up blood and finished singing supported by his stage partner. The doctors diagnosed pleurisy, but this was not the whole truth. As early as February, he suffered a collapse and the doctors pumped pus out of a collapsed lung. When he was fit for transportation again, he left New York, moved by the many people who attended his departure, unaware that it was a farewell forever. He embarked for Italy with Dorothy and their daughter, where he took a vacation in Sorrento on the Amalfi Coast. But in July, Caruso suffered a relapse and the doctors ordered an immediate operation in Rome. He was then taken to Naples, where he spent the night in the Hotel Vesuvio and died in his hotel room. A large crowd attended the funerals in Naples, where his grave still lies today. His embalmed body was displayed in a glass coffin for 9 years until his widow Dorothy put an end to the spooky affair.